Washington, 1803. The President of the United States is about to send 2 men and 40 soldiers to find something he has good reason to believe may not be there. He will tell the public it is a journey of science. It is not. And the 2 men carrying his secret west, Meriwether Lewis and William Clark, have no idea that the thing they are about to risk their lives for may be a ghost. For 2.5 years they will chase it. They will drag a boat up a river that does not want to be climbed. They will starve. They will freeze. They will walk into the territory of nations more powerful than the country they serve, and they will survive only because those nations decide, again and again, to let them live. They will lose men. They will eat their own horses. They will push so far past the edge of the known world that, back home, the entire expedition will quietly be given up for dead. And at the very centre of all of it, waiting on the far side of a mountain, is the thing they were sent to find. A river. One specific river. A great, gentle waterway that is supposed to flow west, all the way to the Pacific Ocean. A road of moving water cutting clean across the whole continent. The dream is that you could load a boat in the heart of America and float, almost without stopping, to the other side of the world. Find that river, and you have not just made a map. You have handed a young, fragile nation the keys to a continent, and broken the grip of every empire that wants it too. There is only one problem with the dream. It does not exist. But here is what they never taught you in school. You were not given this story. You were given a cleaner one. 2 brave explorers, a noble adventure into the unknown, a heroic walk across the empty wilderness of a new nation, gathering plants and naming rivers and shaking hands with the people they met along the way. And that story is not exactly a lie. It is just the polished version, the classroom version, the one with the blood and the hunger and the secret orders and the quiet theft all scrubbed away until nothing is left but a painting of 2 men pointing bravely at a sunset. The real story is stranger. What if the most celebrated expedition in American history failed at the one thing it was actually sent to do, and the country decided to call it a triumph anyway? What if the empty land they crossed was not empty at all, but crowded with nations, borders, languages, and powers, and the explorers were not conquerors striding through a wilderness, but guests being tolerated, watched, and quietly judged at every step? What if the men in Washington already half suspected the truth and sent these 2 anyway, because a nation will gamble almost anything on a dream it cannot afford to give up? If you're listening to this to fall asleep, that is exactly what these long journeys are for, so settle in. And if you feel like it, leave a comment and tell me where in the world you're listening from and what time it is for you right now. It is a strange and lovely thing to picture someone in Sydney watching the sun come up, and someone in Chicago lying awake long after midnight, and someone in Cairo with the city humming softly outside the window, all drifting through the same old story together in the dark. Tonight, we go back 200 years, but not to the version with the heroic paintings and the simple answers. We're going back to a quiet room in Washington, where a brilliant, restless man is staring at a map of a continent he has never seen, and deciding to bet 2 human lives on a river that lives only in his head. We will follow that river west, up the Missouri, into the country of nations who hold every advantage, through a winter that should have killed everyone, to a teenage girl carrying a baby across 1,000 miles whose presence will quietly save the whole expedition, to a coincidence so unlikely that if you wrote it into a story, no one would believe you, and finally to a single afternoon on a mountain pass where one man climbs the last ridge, certain he is about to win, and instead comes face to face with the ghost. So let us begin where it began, not with the river, with the dream. To understand why two men were sent to die for a river, you have to understand how old the dream was. It did not begin with Jefferson. It began centuries before him, the moment the first European ships bumped into the Americas and realized, with something close to despair, that this enormous wall of land was in the way. Because they had not been looking for America. America was an accident. What they wanted was Asia. The silk, the spice, the unimaginable wealth of the East. And now this entire unexpected continent stood between Europe and everything it desired, stretching from ice to ice with no obvious way through. So they began to hope. Somewhere, they told themselves, there had to be a gap, a strait, a river that ran all the way through, a water passage that would let a ship slip from the Atlantic to the Pacific without ever unloading its cargo. They gave it a name before they ever found it, the Northwest Passage, and for 300 years men sailed into the freezing north and died looking for it. Ships were crushed in ice, crews vanished, whole expeditions sailed out and were never heard from again, swallowed by a passage that, in the form they imagined, was never there. But the dream would not die. It was too valuable to die. And by the time Thomas Jefferson became president, the dream had simply moved. If there was no easy passage by sea around the top of the continent, then perhaps there was one straight through the middle of it, by river. Picture the logic the way Jefferson did, late at night, by candlelight. The great Missouri River rises somewhere far to the west and flows down into the heart of the country. The great Columbia River, sailors had reported, empties into the Pacific on the far western coast. Surely, these two rivers must reach toward each other. Surely their sources lie close together, separated by nothing more than a low ridge, a gentle hill, a short walk where a man might carry a canoe from one watershed to the other in an afternoon. A single, short portage. That was the whole dream. Lift your boat over one modest rise, set it back in the water on the other side, and float to the ocean. If that portage existed, whoever controlled it would control the trade of half the world. And this is the part that turns the dream from a fantasy into a weapon. Jefferson was not a man chasing beauty. He was a man chasing a continent. Britain was pressing down from Canada, its fur companies pushing west, mapping as they came. Spain held the southwest and claimed more. Russia was creeping down the Pacific coast from the north. The land was being quietly carved up by empires far stronger than the young United States, and whoever found the water road first would have a claim no one could easily break. So the river in Jefferson's head was never really about geography. It was about survival. It was the difference between a small experimental republic on the edge of the Atlantic and a power that reached from one ocean to the other. And Jefferson wanted it so badly, believed in it so completely, that he was willing to do something that should have been impossible. He was willing to buy a continent he had never seen, for a road he was not sure was there, which is exactly what he did next. And the story of that purchase is so reckless, so enormous, and so strange that it is hard to believe it actually happened. In 1803, Jefferson made the largest land deal in human history, and he made most of it almost by accident. He had only wanted a city. New Orleans, sitting at the mouth of the Mississippi, controlled the entire flow of trade out of the American interior. Whoever held it could choke the country whenever they liked. So Jefferson sent men to France to try to buy the city, or at least the right to use its port. But France at that moment was run by Napoleon, and Napoleon had problems of his own. A war coming with Britain, a disaster unfolding in the Caribbean, an empty treasury. He did not want to defend a vast, distant wilderness in North America that he could not hold. So he made a counteroffer that no one in the room had expected. He did not offer the city. He offered everything, the whole of Louisiana, not the small state we know by that name today, but a staggering territory stretching from the Mississippi River deep into the west, climbing all the way up toward the Rocky Mountains, hundreds of millions of acres, an expanse of land so large it would roughly double the size of the United States in a single signature. Think about the position those American negotiators were in. They had been sent to buy one port. They were suddenly being offered a third of a continent for a price right now. Take it or leave it before Napoleon changed his mind. There was no time to write home and ask. The decision had to be made on the spot. They said yes. For around $15 million, the United States bought a wilderness it could not measure, could not picture, and had never walked. And here is the detail that should keep you awake. Jefferson, the man who signed for all of it, the man who now technically owned this enormous stretch of the earth, had only the faintest idea what was actually in it. No one in Washington did. They did not know how wide it truly was. They did not know how high the mountains rose, or how many ranges there were, or whether the rivers connected the way the dream required. The maps they owned were a patchwork of guesses, rumour and blank space, decorated in places with mountains that did not exist, and rivers drawn from imagination. Some maps still showed creatures in the empty quarters. Some showed a single tidy range of mountains, easily crossed, with the longed-for river waiting politely on the other side. It was a purchase made almost entirely on faith, and now that the country had spent a fortune on this unknown, unseen, unmeasured expanse, one question pressed harder than all the others, the same question that had haunted Europe for 300 years, only now it was personal and it was urgent, and the answer was worth everything. Was the river there? Was there a water road across this new American empire? Or had the young nation just gambled its future on a continent that could not be crossed? There was only one way to find out. Someone had to go and look. Someone had to walk into the heart of the unknown and either find the passage or prove, once and for all, that the oldest dream in the New World was a lie. And Jefferson already knew exactly who he was going to send. Here is where the polished story and the real one quietly split apart. In the version most people are taught, the expedition is a scientific mission, a journey of curiosity. Brave men sent to discover plants, animals and rivers, to fill in the blank map for the pure love of knowledge. And there is truth in that. They really did gather specimens. They really did record hundreds of plants and animals unknown to science back east. Jefferson genuinely loved that part. He was a man who could lie awake thinking about fossils and seed varieties and the bones of ancient creatures. But that was not why the mission existed, and Jefferson knew it. When he went to Congress to ask for the money, he did not stand up and announce a bold imperial expedition to claim a water route to the Pacific before the British could. He could not. Much of the land he wanted to send the expedition through was, at the time of planning, not even American yet. It was still claimed by foreign powers. To announce that the United States was sending an armed party to survey it for future control would have been a provocation, maybe even an act of war. So he sent his request in secret, a confidential message meant for Congress alone, asking for a modest sum of money, and he dressed the whole thing carefully in the soft language of science and trade. He spoke of commerce with the native nations, of extending friendly business, of the general advancement of knowledge. He framed it as something gentle, something almost academic, a literary pursuit as much as anything. It was camouflage. Underneath the gentle language, the real instructions Jefferson would give to the man he chose were something else entirely. Find the most direct water communication across the continent for the purposes of commerce. Map it. Record it. Establish by your presence the claim of the United States. Study the native nations not only out of kindness, but to learn their numbers, their strength, their trade, their alliances, the kind of knowledge a power gathers about lands it intends one day to absorb. Watch for the British. Watch for the Spanish. Note where they are and how far their influence reaches. This was not a nature walk. It was an intelligence mission, an imperial reconnaissance and a land claim, wearing the costume of a scientific adventure. And that costume was so convincing that it has lasted 200 years. It is still the costume the story wears today, in the textbooks and the murals and the memorials. The brave discoverers, gathering knowledge in the noble wild. Hold that idea, because it is going to matter all the way to the end of this long night. The expedition was never really about what it found. It was about what it was for, and what it was for was a dream of empire, sent west under a quiet lie, into a country that did not belong to the men who were claiming it. Now Jefferson needed someone to carry that dream, someone he could trust completely, because the man would be beyond the reach of any letter, any order, any help, for years at a time. Someone tough enough to survive and loyal enough to keep the secret. He chose a young man he already knew very well. His name was Meriwether Lewis, and he was, in many ways, a strange choice. He was young, somewhere around his late 20s. He had served in the army, knew the frontier, could handle himself in the wild. And he had been living for the past few years right inside the president's house, serving as Jefferson's private secretary. The two men knew each other's minds. Jefferson had been quietly training him, sending him to learn the things the journey would demand, how to read the stars to find a position on the earth, how to press and preserve plants, how to treat the sick and injured, how to take the measurements that would turn wilderness into a map. Lewis was brilliant, observant, and deeply devoted to the mission. He was also, by the accounts of those who knew him, a man with shadows in him, moody, prone to dark spells, the kind of man who could be magnificent in a crisis and then sink into a heaviness no one around him could lift. Remember that. It is quiet now, but it does not stay quiet. Lewis understood something the moment the mission became real. No one man could carry it alone. So he wrote to an old friend from his army days and asked him to share the command. A man he trusted with his life, William Clark. If Lewis was the dreamer, the scholar, the one with the storms inside him, Clark was the steady hand. Older, calmer, practical, a natural leader of men, a gifted map-maker, a man who could look at a river and a horizon and turn them into lines on paper with astonishing accuracy. Where Lewis brooded, Clark organized. Where Lewis saw the poetry of the land, Clark saw the angles and the distances. Together they made something rare. Two commanders who, across years of hardship and danger, almost never turned on each other. In an expedition where everything else broke down, their partnership held, and around these two gathered the rest. Roughly 40 men in the core party that would push west. Soldiers, hunters, boatmen, men chosen for their strength and their skills and their willingness to walk off the edge of the map. Most of them young, most of them with no idea what they were truly walking into. Among them were two who are too often left out of the painting. One was a man named York. He was enslaved. He was Clark's property. taken west not as a free member of the expedition but as a body Clark owned. And yet York would do everything the others did. He would carry, hunt, paddle, scout, and face every danger the rest faced. To many of the native peoples they met, who had never seen a person like him, he would be an object of wonder and deep curiosity. He would, in the wilderness, live something closer to equality than he had ever known. And when it was all over, when the others were rewarded with land and money and fame, he would be returned to slavery. Hold his name too. He earned more than history gave him. The other was not a man at all, but a large Newfoundland dog named Seaman, who would walk the entire journey to the Pacific and back and somehow survive it. This was the core. A handful of people, a few boats, a dog, and a secret. About to vanish into a continent that did not know they were coming and would not have been impressed if it had. And in the spring they set out, up the river, into the unknown, toward the ghost. Imagine the morning they left. The water of the Missouri, brown and heavy and endless, sliding past the boats. The men loading the last of the supplies, the barrels and bundles and tools and trade goods, the whole of their survival packed into wood that would have to carry them thousands of miles. Behind them, the last edge of the country they knew. Ahead of them, a river that climbed away to the northwest, toward a place that existed on every map they owned, mostly as a guess. They began to push upstream. And here is the first thing the polished story never makes you feel. Going up the Missouri was not an adventure. It was a war against the river, fought every single day, for month after month after month. The Missouri does not flow gently. It pulls. It pushes mud and whole drowned trees down its current, hidden just beneath the surface, ready to tear the bottom out of a boat. Its banks collapse without warning, dropping tons of earth into the water. The current runs hard against you the entire way, because you're going the wrong direction, climbing toward the source of everything it is trying to bring down. So the men did not simply sail. When the wind failed, they rowed. When rowing failed, they took up long poles and pushed the boat forward against the bottom, step by aching step. And when even that failed, they climbed out into the water and the mud, tied ropes to the boat, and dragged it. Dragged it. Men in the shallows and along the bank, hauling tons of wood and cargo upstream by brute force, hour after hour, their feet cut by rocks and prickly pear, the sun hammering down, insects rising off the water in clouds thick enough to choke on. Picture trying to sleep at the end of a day like that. Soaked, sunburned, bitten raw, your hands torn, lying on the ground beside a river that will demand the exact same thing from you tomorrow, and the day after, and for as many days as it takes to reach a place no one in your world has ever seen. This is the texture the paintings leave out. The expedition was, for enormous stretches, simply suffering. Slow, grinding, repetitive suffering, measured not in miles but in yards. But as they climbed, something began to change around them. The country opened up. The forests of the east gave way to vast rolling grasslands stretching further than the eye could hold, an ocean of grass under an enormous sky. And the land was alive in a way that stunned them. Herds of animals beyond counting, bison in numbers that darkened the plains, elk, deer, antelope, wolves, and a creature they had been warned about but did not yet understand. An enormous bear, faster and stronger and harder to kill than anything they had ever hunted, that would soon teach them real fear. It looked, to their eyes, like a wilderness, untouched, empty, waiting. And that impression, that this was empty land, wild and ownerless, open for the taking, was the single greatest mistake they could make. because it was not empty. It had never been empty, and they were about to learn that the hard way. Here is the reversal at the very heart of this story, the one that changes everything you thought you understood about it. The West was not a blank. It was a world, a crowded, ancient, deeply organized world, full of nations who had lived on that land for hundreds of generations, who knew every river and ridge and season of it the way you know the rooms of your own home. They were not scattered, simple bands wandering an empty wild. They were peoples with names, governments, borders, laws, histories, rivalries, alliances, and economies that reached across enormous distances. There were nations along that river who were powerful, settled, and rich. There were great trading towns where goods moved across half the continent, where corn and beans grown by farming nations were traded for the meat and hides of the hunting peoples, where shells from one distant ocean and metals from faraway lands passed from hand to hand along trade routes older than any country in Europe. There were diplomatic systems with their own rules of war and peace and hospitality. There were powers on those plains that could field more warriors, mounted and armed, than the United States could have sent against them. The core of discovery was, by comparison, tiny. 40-odd men, far from home, far from any help, deep inside territory that did not belong to them. If the nations they met had decided at almost any point to wipe them out, they could have, easily. So the expedition was never simply marching through. It was negotiating its way through. And this is the part the heroic story buries most deeply of all. At every major nation they reached, Lewis and Clark stopped and performed a ritual. They gathered the leaders. They handed out gifts, bright cloth, tools, beads, tobacco, and special medals stamped with the face of a man none of these people had ever heard of. And they gave a speech, always some version of the same speech. They announced that there was a new great father in the East, that a vast power now claimed this land and everything in it, that the nations gathered before them were now, whether they understood it or not, the children of this distant ruler, and should keep the peace and trade with the Americans and obey. Think about how that must have landed. Picture standing among your own people, on your own land, the land of your ancestors and your children, when a small group of exhausted, strange-smelling foreigners arrives by boat. They cannot feed themselves without help. They cannot read the country around them, and they stand up and calmly inform you that you now belong to a king you have never met, in a place you cannot imagine, and that the ground beneath your feet, the ground that holds your dead, has a new owner. To the Americans, this was diplomacy. A formal claim, words that mattered, a flag planted in speech. To the nations who heard it, it must often have seemed somewhere between meaningless and insane. They had their own powers, their own alliances, their own sense of who they were. They did not need a great father across the world. Some were curious, some were welcoming, hoping these strangers might bring useful trade and useful weapons, and some were not impressed at all. And before long the expedition would meet one nation that was not impressed in the slightest, a nation that controlled a stretch of the river the Americans had to pass, that understood exactly how much power it held, and that was entirely willing to use it. The first real test was coming, and it very nearly ended everything. They were a people the Americans called the Teton Sioux. They were Lakota, and they held a critical stretch of the Missouri the way a gatekeeper holds a door. This was not an accident of geography. It was power, earned and held. The nations upstream needed goods from below. The traders from below needed to move upriver. And the Lakota sat in the middle of that flow, strong enough to demand a price from anyone who wished to pass. They were skilled, mounted, numerous, and confident. They had dealt with outsiders before, and they had no reason to bow to a few dozen men in boats. When the Corps arrived, the meeting curdled almost immediately. The Americans expected the same script that had worked elsewhere: gifts, a speech, medals, peace, passage. But the gifts they offered were seen as insulting in their smallness. The speech about a distant great father meant nothing to a nation that answered to no one on that river. And the Lakota made their own position very clear. If these strangers wished to continue upstream, through territory the Lakota controlled, there would be a toll, goods, tribute, a price for the door. The tension rose fast. Picture the scene on the riverbank. The Americans, badly outnumbered, gripping their weapons, trying to look far more dangerous than their small numbers made them. The Lakota warriors gathered close, unimpressed, holding every real advantage. At one point, a boat was seized. At one point, bows were drawn and arrows knocked. At one point, Clark himself drew his sword, and the men readied the boat's small cannon, and for a few breathless heartbeats the entire expedition balanced on the edge of a fight it could not possibly win. If a single weapon had gone off in that moment, a single arrow, a single shot, a single nervous hand, the story you've been hearing tonight would have ended right there, on a muddy bank far up the Missouri, with the bodies of 40 Americans and the wreckage of Jefferson's dream. No Pacific, no map, no legend, just a small massacre in the grass that the world would barely have noticed. It did not happen. Through a tense knife-edge mixture of bluff, restraint and luck, the moment passed. The weapons came down. The expedition was allowed eventually to move on. But the lesson should have been carved into every man there and into every story told about them since. They had survived not because they were powerful, not because they were clever, not because their flag or their great father meant anything out here. They had survived because in the end the Lakota chose to let them. Permission, that is the word. The Corps moved west on permission, granted and withdrawn by nations who held the real power and who could have closed the door at any time. Remember that word. Permission. Because it is about to save the entire expedition again, in a far gentler way, in the heart of a brutal winter that should have frozen them all. By the time the cold came down, the men were exhausted, and the river had carried them far into the northern plains. They could not go on. Winter on that open country is not an inconvenience. It is a killer. Months of wind and snow and a cold deep enough to take fingers, toes, and lives. They needed shelter. They needed food. They needed to stop. And they were lucky beyond anything they had earned, because they had arrived in the country of the Mandan and the Hidatsa. These were not small, struggling bands. They were farming nations, living in large, established towns of warm, round, earth-covered lodges, with stored harvests of corn and beans and squash, and trade networks that pulled goods from across the continent. Their towns, taken together, held thousands of people. At that moment, on that stretch of the river, they formed one of the great population and trading centres of the northern plains. More people gathered in one place than in many an American city back east. The Corps built a small fort nearby and settled in to wait out the cold. They called it Fort Mandan. And over that long, frozen winter, a quiet truth became impossible to ignore. The expedition survived because the Mandan and Hidatsa let it. The Americans traded for food, again and again, because the nations had food stored and they did not. The men warmed themselves at fires in a country the locals had mastered and they had not. They learned, from people who had lived there for generations, what lay ahead to the west. Which rivers, which nations, which mountains, which dangers. The towns became a place of exchange in every sense. Goods, knowledge, company, survival. Without that welcome, that winter would have been a grave. Picture it. The endless white outside, the wind screaming across the plains, and inside, warmth and food and the low sound of voices in a language the Americans were slowly learning to read, given freely by people who owed these strangers nothing and could have simply let the cold do its work. And it was here, in this winter town, in the middle of this dependence, that a single person joined the expedition who would become the most famous member of it. A person the heroic story would later turn into a symbol, a statue, a simplified legend, while quietly erasing almost everything true and painful about who she actually was. A teenager, a captive, a mother with a newborn child. Her story is not the story you were told either. You probably know her name, Sacagawea, and you probably know the version of her the country built afterward, the noble guide, the serene woman pointing the way west, leading the brave explorers through the wilderness like a living compass. Her face is on coins, her name is on lakes and mountains and schools. She became one of the most celebrated figures in the whole story. Now here is who she actually was. She was young, by most reckonings still in her teens, and she was not, in the simple sense, a guide who chose to lead the Americans anywhere. She was Shoshone, but she was not living among the Shoshone. Years earlier, as a child, she'd been taken, captured in a raid by another nation, carried hundreds of miles from her home and her people, and eventually she came into the possession of a French-Canadian fur trader, living among the Hidatsa. That trader was much older than her. She was in effect his property, one of his wives in name, acquired rather than chosen. When the expedition hired that trader as an interpreter for the journey west, she came as part of the arrangement, and she came pregnant. Over that hard winter at Fort Mandan, still only a teenager, she gave birth to a baby boy, and then, with a newborn infant, she set out to cross thousands of miles of brutal country with a party of 40 armed men, almost none of whom she had chosen to be among. Sit with that for a moment before the legend takes over. A captured girl, taken from her home as a child, given to a much older man, becomes a mother in a freezing fort at the edge of the world, and then carries her baby on her back into the deadliest journey of the age. And here is the part that is true, and that does matter, even after you strip the legend away. She became essential. Not as a magical guide drawing lines on the land, but in deeper, quieter ways the men could not have managed without. She knew plants the Americans did not, and could find food where they saw only ground. When a boat nearly capsized in a river, and priceless records and instruments were swept into the water, it was she who stayed calm and saved them from the current. And most importantly of all, her very presence changed how every nation they met perceived them. Because a war party does not travel with a young woman and a baby. When other nations saw her and saw the infant on her back, they understood something instantly. These strangers, whatever else they were, had not come to fight. A child is a sign of peace, in a way no speech or medal could ever be. Without ever intending it, simply by existing, she became the single most disarming thing the expedition carried. A living signal that lowered weapons and opened doors across 1,000 miles. The Corps owed her a debt it never repaid. When the journey ended, the men were rewarded with money and land. She received nothing of the kind, and her own voice, her own thoughts about any of it, are almost entirely lost to us. We have thousands of words from Lewis and Clark. From her, Across the whole journey, we have almost nothing. A few mentions, a handful of moments seen through other men's eyes. What did she think, this captured girl, as she carried her child back toward the very mountain she had been stolen from as a small child? We will come to that, because the journey was about to deliver one of the strangest coincidences in all of history, and it would happen to her. But first, the river was running out, and with it the dream. As spring came and the expedition pushed on, the country began to rise. The endless plains gave way, slowly at first and then unmistakably to higher and harder ground. The river that had fought them for so long began to change its character. It split and split again into branches and forks, growing narrower, shallower, faster and colder. The great brown Missouri that had carried boats was becoming a mountain stream tumbling down out of high country, and every man who understood the dream understood what that meant. The river was running out. Somewhere ahead lay the source, the place where the Missouri began as a trickle in the hills, and that source was the whole point, because the dream said that the source of the Missouri would lie close to the source of the Columbia, the river that ran to the Pacific. Find where the Missouri ended, the thinking went, and you would be a short walk from where the road to the ocean began. One low ridge, one easy portage, the water highway. So now there was a new tension threaded through every day. It was not just the suffering of the climb, it was the question, where does the river end? And what is on the other side? The hunting grew leaner. The country grew steeper. The men were tiring and the season was turning, and a quiet, urgent fear began to settle over the leaders. They were deep in the mountain's shadow now, in country they could not read, and they had not seen another human being in a very long time. They needed something badly. They needed horses to carry their gear over whatever lay ahead. And to get horses they needed to find the people who had them. The Shoshone, the mountain nation, Sacagawea's people, the very nation she'd been taken from as a child. But the Shoshone were nowhere to be found. The expedition pushed up toward the headwaters, scanning the empty hills, finding only traces, old trails, signs that people had been here and gone. The Shoshone, wary of enemies, kept to the high country and were hard to find by anyone they did not wish to meet. And without them, without horses, the expedition would be trapped. Too far to turn back before winter. Too weak to cross the mountains on foot, carrying everything. The fear must have been suffocating. To have come so far, suffered so much, dragged so much weight up so many miles of unforgiving river, and to feel it all about to fail, not in a great battle, but quietly, in the high cold silence, for want of horses and a few friendly faces that would not appear. So Lewis did what Lewis did. He went ahead. He took a small handful of men and pushed up the final stretch of the Missouri on foot, racing the season, desperate to crest the divide, find the Shoshone, and look, at last, upon the thing the entire nation had gambled its future on. He was about to climb the last ridge, and on the other side of it, the dream of 300 years was waiting to die. Before we climb that ridge, the journey demands that we pause on a coincidence so unlikely it strains belief. Because while Lewis was racing ahead, the rest of the party, including Sacagawea, was working its way up behind him. And what happened when the Shoshone were finally found is the kind of thing history almost never allows. Lewis, scouting forward, made contact first. After the long emptiness, his small party at last encountered Shoshone people in the high country, wary, frightened, ready to flee from what they assumed might be enemies. Through careful, patient signs of peace, Lewis managed to convince them he meant no harm. and was brought to their band and met their chief, a man named Camyawait. The desperate negotiation for horses began, slow and uncertain, the whole expedition's survival hanging on whether these mountain people would help. Then the rest of the corps caught up, and Sacagawea was brought forward to help translate between the Americans and the Shoshone, the language of her childhood returning to her mouth after years away. And as the council began, she looked at the chief, and she knew him. Camyawait, the leader of this band, the man who held the expedition's fate in his hands, was her brother. Stop and feel the size of that. A girl is stolen from her people as a small child, carried hundreds of miles away, passed through captivity into the household of a stranger, drawn, years later, into a foreign expedition crossing a continent by a chain of events no one could have planned, and at the single most critical moment of the entire journey, deep in the mountains, the one person who can secure the horses they must have to survive turns out to be her own lost brother, reunited across all that distance and all those years in the middle of the wilderness by what can only be called impossible chance. If you put it in a novel, an editor would cross it out. Too convenient, too neat, no reader would accept it. And yet, it happened. The reunion changed the mood of the council. The bonds of family, suddenly and astonishingly restored, helped warm the negotiation. The Shoshone agreed to help. The expedition got its horses and a guide who knew something of the terrible country ahead and the knowledge it needed to attempt the crossing. It is tempting to call it a miracle, to say that fate itself reached down to save the journey at its most fragile moment, and maybe, lying there in the dark, you can let it feel that way. But hold, for 1 second, the other side of it. Sit with what this reunion actually was. A young woman returned for a few brief days to the people and the place she'd been torn from as a child, only to be moving on again, almost at once, deeper into the mountains, away from her brother and her homeland, carrying her baby into a foreign mission that would not let her stay. She found her people, and then she left them. We do not know what that cost her. We never will. Her voice, again, is silent. The horses were secured. The path, such as it was, lay open, and Lewis, ahead of the council, had already climbed to the high pass to look west, to finally see, with his own eyes, the thing they had all come for. It is time to climb the ridge. August 12th, 1805, a high pass on the very spine of the continent, on what is now the border between Montana and Idaho. The Missouri, the great river that had fought the expedition for more than a year and over 1,000 miles, has dwindled at last to a tiny, ice-cold trickle running out of the hills. One of the men steps across it with a foot on either side, laughing, marvelling that he has lived to straddle the source of the mighty Missouri, this river that had seemed to have no end. Lewis drinks from the little stream. He has reached it, the most distant fountain of the river they had bled to climb. After all the toil, all the sleepless nights, all the miles, he has arrived at the place the entire journey was bending toward. In his own writing he records the feeling that he had accomplished one of the great objects on which his mind had been fixed for years, and now there is only the ridge above him, the dividing line, the crest of the continent. On the far side, the dream says, the land will fall away toward the Pacific, and somewhere below will be the headwaters of the Columbia, the Western River, the road to the ocean. A short walk down, a boat back in the water, and then the gentle current carrying them at last to the sea. 300 years of hope, a continent bought on faith, a nation's future, 2.5 years of suffering. All of it has narrowed now to a single short climb and a single glance west. Lewis goes up the last of the rise. He reaches the top. He looks west. And there is no river. There is no gentle slope to the sea. There is no shining water road. There is no Columbia waiting at his feet. No easy passage, no portage, no dream. There are mountains, range after range after range of them, marching away to the horizon, peak behind peak behind peak, their tops still white with snow in the middle of August, stretching past the edge of the sky. In his own words scratched into his journal, immense ranges of high mountains still to the west, their tops partially covered with snow. Not one ridge to cross, not one easy hill, an entire ocean of stone, vast and cold and merciless, standing between him and the Pacific. The Northwest Passage does not exist. It never existed. Not by sea around the frozen north, where men had died for 3 centuries, and not here, not by river through the gentle heart of the continent, where Jefferson had dreamed it into being. There is no water road across America. There never was. The oldest dream of the New World, the hope that had launched expeditions and emptied treasuries and sent men to their deaths, dies in a single, silent moment, on a mountain pass, witnessed only by a handful of tired men. And the cruelest part is how quiet it is. There is no enemy to fight, no storm to curse, no dramatic disaster to rage against. Just one man standing on a ridge, looking at a truth he cannot change, understanding in a single breath that the thing his country sent him across the world to find was a ghost all along. He does not have the luxury of falling apart. There is no time. Winter is coming. The men are far from any safety, and the only way now is forward, on horses begged from the Shoshone, over the very mountains that have just shattered the dream, through some of the most brutal country on the continent. The dream is dead. The journey is not. He must keep walking into the teeth of the thing that just defeated him. And what comes next will be the worst suffering of the entire expedition. The mountains they had to cross are called the Bitterroots. And of everything the Corps endured, this was the closest they came to simply dying. The dream had imagined a short, gentle portage. The reality was a labyrinth of steep, knife-edged ridges and deep, cold valleys, choked with fallen timber, with no easy path through, in a range that went on and on far beyond anything they had pictured. They went on horseback now, along a punishing trail through the high country, and almost at once the situation began to turn desperate. The first enemy was the cold. They were high in the mountains as autumn turned, and the snow began to fall on them, early and hard, deepening on the trail, hiding the way, soaking them through, freezing them at night. The horses struggled and slipped on the steep ground. Some fell. Gear was lost down the slopes, and the second enemy, the one that nearly broke them, was hunger. There was almost nothing to hunt up there. The great herds of the plains were a memory now. In that high, cold, broken country, game was scarce to the point of absence, and the men were burning enormous energy just to keep moving over the terrain. Their food ran low and then lower, and then it ran out. They grew weak. They grew sick. The cold and the starvation fed on each other, hollowing the men out as they climbed. In the end, they were reduced to the last grim resort of starving travellers. They began to kill and eat their own horses, the animals they needed to carry them, slaughtered one by one to keep the men alive a little longer. And even that was not enough. They ate candles. They ate whatever they could choke down. They staggered through the snow, freezing, famished, growing weaker by the day, with no way of knowing how much more of this stone wilderness lay ahead, or whether it would ever end. This is the true cost the painting never shows. Not noble discovery. Starving men eating their horses in the snow, lost in a mountain range that should not have been there, paying in flesh and bone for a dream that had already died behind them. And when they finally came down out of the worst of it, barely, half dead, at the very edge of their strength, they were saved again. Not by their own power, once more by the decision of a nation. They stumbled out of the mountains into the country of the Nez Perce, and the Nez Perce, finding these ruined, starving strangers at the edge of their land, chose to help them. They fed them. They could just as easily have done otherwise. A small party of broken, defenceless foreigners. It would have been nothing to let them die, or to finish them. Some among the Nez Perce, it is said, even considered it. But they chose mercy. They fed the men back toward life, and helped them, and let them continue toward the great river that would, at last, carry them down toward the sea. Permission, again. Mercy, again, from the people of the land. The expedition lived, over and over, on kindness it had not earned and could not have compelled. The worst was behind them now. Ahead lay rivers running the right direction at last. West, downhill toward the ocean. After everything, the Pacific was finally close. But even that, even the great triumphant arrival at the edge of the world would not be the glory they had dreamed. Even the ocean would have a disappointment waiting. They built canoes, and at last they were going with the current instead of against it. Down the rivers, west and down, through the country of many nations toward the coast. After more than a year of fighting upstream, the water was finally on their side. And then, one day, in the distance through the mist, Clark believed he saw it. He wrote it in his journal in a burst of joy, in his own rough spelling. Ocean in view. Oh, the joy. After everything, the Pacific, the far edge of the continent, the end of the road. Except it was not quite the ocean. What he had actually seen in the grey distance was the wide estuary of the great river opening toward the sea. A broad, storm-tossed expanse of water, still miles from the true coast. The ocean itself was further on, and the final stretch toward it would be one of the most miserable passages of the entire journey. The weather on that coast was savage. Cold, ceaseless rain. Storms that pinned them down for days against the shore, unable to move, their gear rotting, their food spoiling, the relentless wet soaking into everything and everyone. They huddled in wretched camps along the water, sick and exhausted, so close to their goal and yet trapped, battered by a coast that did not care that they had crossed a continent to reach it. When they finally reached the true Pacific and could go no further west, there was, of course, a moment of triumph. They had done it. They had walked and paddled and frozen and starved their way across the entire unknown breadth of the continent, from the heart of the country to the western sea, and they were alive. Most of them, astonishingly, were alive. It was a staggering feat of endurance, and it deserved its moment. But there was no golden city, no grand reward, no passage. They had reached the end of the land and found only more grey water and rain and a long, hard winter to get through before they could even begin the brutal journey home. They built a small fort near the coast to wait out that winter, and it was a grim, wet, hungry place. The rain almost never stopped. The mood was low, and they were watching all winter for one specific thing that never came. They knew that trading ships sometimes visited that coast by sea. They hoped one might arrive, a ship that could carry their records home safely, or resupply them, or simply confirm to the world that they had made it. They watched the horizon all season. No ship came. So in the spring there was nothing to do but turn around and walk back. All of it. The mountains, the rivers, the plains, the whole murderous distance in reverse, to carry home the answer to the question the nation had sent them to settle. And the answer was the hardest one of all. Not the joyful answer of a passage found, the heavy, disappointing, world-changing answer of a passage that was never there. So what in the end did they actually find? If not the river, if not the road, if not the dream, what did they bring home from the far side of the continent? The truth turns out to be larger and stranger and sadder than any river. They did not find the thing they were sent to find. On the one mission that justified the whole enormous gamble, the water road across the continent, they failed. Completely. The passage was a ghost, and they were the ones who finally proved it. And yet, they came home with something else. Something Jefferson had asked for almost as an afterthought, wrapped in the gentle language of science, but which would turn out to matter more than the river ever could have. They came home with the truth about the continent. They had crossed the entire width of the unknown West and lived to describe it. They brought back maps, Clark's maps, drawn with extraordinary care, that for the first time gave a roughly accurate shape to the vast interior, its rivers, its mountains, the real and terrible scale of the ranges that had killed the dream. They brought back descriptions of hundreds of plants and animals unknown to Eastern science. They brought back a detailed account of the nations of the West, their locations, their numbers, their strength, their trade, their alliances. Exactly the inventory Jefferson had quietly requested. A catalogue of the peoples and the riches of a continent. And here is where the story turns from disappointment into something darker, and where you finally see what the expedition truly was, because all of that knowledge, the maps, the routes, the catalogue of nations, the assessment of the land and its wealth, became the instrument of everything that followed. It was the door held open. Behind these two men, in the years and decades to come, would pour the traders, the soldiers, the settlers, the railroads, the relentless westward weight of a growing nation. The expedition did not just describe the West, it made the West legible. It turned an unknown into a map, and a map is the first tool of taking. Now hold this beside everything you have heard tonight, and feel its full weight. The nations who saved the core, who fed them, who sold them horses, who chose mercy over killing, who let them pass on permission again and again, were the very nations whose worlds this knowledge would help to destroy. The Mandan, in their great river towns, who warmed them through the first winter. The Shoshone, who gave them the horses without which they would have died, and whose chief was a captured girl's lost brother. The Nez Perce, who found them starving in the snow and chose to feed them instead of letting them perish. The peoples all along that river, who watched these strangers arrive helpless and let them live. Within a few generations, almost all of them would face the same fate, their land taken, their people pushed onto fragments of what had been theirs, their power broken, their numbers cut down by disease and war and removal. The continent that the expedition mapped became the continent that was taken, and the map the Corps carried home was one of the first pages of that taking. The expedition survived on the kindness of the people it would help to doom. That is the real thing Lewis and Clark found in the West. Not a passage, a truth. The truth that the land was not empty, that it was full, that it belonged to others, and that the young nation behind them intended to have it anyway. They walked into a living world on borrowed permission, and they carried home the knowledge that would be used to end it. And the country that received them did something with all of this that tells you everything about how history gets made. it decided to call the whole thing a triumph. When the expedition finally returned, after more than 2 years, after the whole nation had largely given them up for dead, they came home to astonishment and celebration. They had crossed the continent and come back. They were heroes, and the awkward truth that they had failed at their actual mission, that the passage they were sent to find did not exist, simply faded away. This is one of the most quietly revealing things in the whole story. The expedition was sent to answer a question. Is there a water road across the continent? The answer it brought back was no. By the standard of its own secret instructions, it did not succeed. The dream that launched it was proven false. But a nation cannot easily celebrate a failure, especially one it has spent a fortune on. So the meaning of the journey was simply rewritten. The point was no longer the passage that wasn't there. The point became the crossing itself, the courage, the endurance, the opening of the West. The triumph was redefined until failure became victory, and the ghost the men had found was politely forgotten, and the painting began to form. The brave discoverers, pointing west into the noble wild. The men who led it scattered into very different fates. Clark, the steady one, the mapmaker, lived a long life and rose to great prominence. And here history twists the knife in a way almost too perfect to be real. The man who had drawn the first true map of the Western nations, who had met them and recorded them and depended on their mercy, was eventually placed in charge of managing them. He became, in effect, the government's chief administrator of Indian affairs in the West, overseeing in his later years the very processes of treaty and removal and dispossession that pushed those nations off their land. The man who had been kept alive by the peoples of the West spent his later life presiding over their decline. He did not see, perhaps, the full shape of the irony, but it is there, plain, in the record. The guest became the gatekeeper of their undoing. Lewis fared differently. The brilliant, brooding man Jefferson had trusted with the whole dream did not find peace after the journey. The shadows in him, the ones that had always been there, deepened. The burdens of the aftermath weighed on him heavily. He did not live many years beyond his return, and his final chapter was a troubled and unhappy one. We will let that be. He gave the journey everything he had, and the wilderness gave him a kind of greatness, and then the world afterward was harder for him than the mountains had been. That is enough to say of it tonight. And Satagawea, the captured girl whose presence had quietly held the whole fragile enterprise together, slipped back into the silence from which history had briefly lifted her. The legend would come for her later. The coins, the statues, the simplified noble guide. But the young woman herself, her real thoughts, her real life, the cost of all of it to her, were never truly recorded. She remains even now mostly a shape we've filled in with our own imaginings. The painting that the country eventually hung on its wall is a beautiful one. 2 heroes, a bold adventure, the dawn of a continent. But you have walked the real road tonight, and you know now what the painting leaves out. The secret orders, the dream that was a ghost, the nations who held all the power, the girl who was a captive, the horses eaten in the snow, the mercy of strangers given again and again, and the knowledge carried home, which would be turned into the taking of everything that knowledge described. Both things are true. It was one of the great feats of human endurance ever attempted, and it was the opening act of a long dispossession. You do not have to choose between them tonight. You can let them both be real, the courage and the cost, the way the truest stories always hold more than one thing at once. So let the story settle now, the way the dust settled on that mountain pass 200 years ago. We began in a quiet room in Washington, with a brilliant man and a map of a place he had never seen, betting 2 lives on a river that lived only in his head. And we followed that river all the way to the truth, up the long, fighting Missouri, through the standoff on the bank and the winter that should have killed them, past the captured girl and her impossible reunion with her brother, to the ridge and the silent moment when the oldest dream of the New World died in a single glance at an ocean of stone. And you understand now what they really found out there. Not the passage, never the passage. They found a continent that was full and ancient and alive and belonged to others. They found that they survived only on the permission and the mercy of the people of the land. And they carried home a knowledge that would be used in the long years after to take all of it away. There are questions that will not close, and you can let them drift with you into sleep. Did Jefferson always know, somewhere underneath the hope, that the river was a fantasy, and send these men anyway because the dream was too valuable to surrender? What did Sacagawea feel in those few days back among her own people, before she turned and carried her child away from them forever into a journey she had never chosen? What would those nations who fed the strangers have done that first winter, that first standoff, that first starving descent from the mountains, if they had been able to see the whole future that those gentle, dangerous visitors were carrying west? We will never know. The men are gone. The captured girl is gone. The dream is long dead. The painting hangs on the wall, and the real story lies quietly underneath it, the way it always has. But the land is still there. The Missouri still runs its long, brown, fighting course down out of the high country. The mountains that kill the dream still stand, range behind range behind range, snow still on their peaks in the heart of summer, exactly as one tired man saw them from a ridge 2 centuries ago. The rivers still flow to the sea, the old trails still lie beneath the new roads, and the names of the nations who held that world and saved those men and lost so much are still carried by their descendants who did not vanish, whatever the painting tried to say. So rest now. If this long walk through the dark was worth taking, you can tap the like button gently, just as a quiet signal that you would like more nights like this one. And if you would like to keep travelling with me through the hidden undersides of the stories we think we know, you can subscribe, and I will keep finding these old, buried, true things and bringing them to you in the dark. And if you feel moved to leave a comment, tell me once more where in the world you're listening from tonight and what the land outside your window is like. Plains or mountains or desert or the glow of a sleepless city. Because every kind of ground carries the same deep memory. Every landscape was known and walked and loved by someone long before the maps we use today were ever drawn. Let the rivers run, let the mountains stand, let the long dream of the passage fade into the dark where it belongs. The continent is still there. It was always there. It was never empty, and it was never waiting, and it never needed to be discovered to be real. Sleep well. The mountains will keep, the rivers will keep, and the old true story will still be here, quietly, in the morning. Rest now. Let the high country do its slow, quiet work in your dreams.